All right, let's just go ahead.
Okay.
Want to give me a countdown?
Yep. 3, 2, 1.
Hey friends, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to come and share the story of Treehouse, about our mission, our vision, and most importantly, our teens. And hopefully it'll lead to dialogue about what Treehouse work and mission could look like in your community, or how your company or your church can engage in what we do. So Treehouse is a mission. A lot of people know that we work with hurting youth and at-risk teens. And I'll get to how we define them, but by our conservative estimates, we ran the numbers, and we believe there's over 100,000 teens just in the 7-county metro area of Minneapolis and St. Paul that would be labeled at risk, that are in the wheelhouse of who we work with. So that's enough teens to fill both US Bank Stadium, where the Vikings play, and TCF Bank Stadium, where the Golden Gophers play. And that's a staggering image when you think about just how many young people that will soon be adults, that will soon be probably parents, trying to enter the workforce. And that's just a snapshot of today, and that's just the 7-county metro area. That doesn't even expand to the 9 or 11-county metro or the larger state or upper Midwest. And so when we say at risk, we don't define it solely by what kids do, their at-risk behaviors. But because people ask, our number one primary at-risk behavior is our kids really struggle with, do I want to live? So 60% of our teens have seriously struggled and asked that question, do I want to live, and have potentially attempted or have strongly thought about suicide. They have suicidal ideation. Over 40% of our teens have cut themselves, sometimes burning, self-harm, really hard things to process. And almost 60% of our teens have been victims of bullying. It makes sense that these would go hand in hand, but these are very dark and hard behaviors. And that's the primary type of things that our teens are dealing with. But again, we don't define at-risk teens by this. We look more at at-risk teens by where are kids coming from, the environments, I would call them the input factors. And the primary two would be the financial status in the home, and I'll call it the parenting status in the home. So 2/3 of our teens qualify for free or reduced lunch. So there's a financial reality in the home. They may be at or below the poverty level, but there is stress on the family unit. And that ties to the other piece. It depends on what the family unit is defined by. Only 25% of Treehouse teens across the board live with both biological mom and biological dad. So we have a lot of single parents. We have a lot of kids that might be living with a grandparent, might be couch surfing, in living situation other, if you will. So there's strain on this side of the equation as well. And when you put both in play, obviously you're going to have teens that are going to struggle. So whenever we are to enter a community, and a community wants to say, Treehouse, could we have a location here? We just kind of look at some key factors to say, well, is there the need? We believe there's a need for Treehouse in every community, but then we just look at some of these factors. So for example, in the community of Shakopee, there's 3,500 students between ages 12 and 18. So this would be 7th through 12th grade, and that's who we work with. And when kids graduate from high school, we want to help them get to something next for their own fellowship, personal growth, relationships, as they look towards post-high school. 1 out of 3 teens in the community are on free or reduced lunch. There are 2 alternative learning centers, 2 mobile home communities, and over 400 apartments that are affordable. To us, that would scream absolutely. There are more than enough teens in this community, not just for one Treehouse location, but possibly 2, 3. I mean, just the needs in the community are significant. So these are some of the factors that we would look at when we enter a community. And we always lead, though, with what's the vision. And the vision of Treehouse is to reach every at-risk teen so that they feel loved, they can feel hope, and they can realize life transformation. And that's the beautiful thing about Treehouse. It's not just temporary work. We're really trying to help kids look towards their future long-term. So in terms of how do we measure life transformation, which is admittedly a very difficult thing to measure, we have 4 goals that I believe are pretty holistic as we look at the life of the child. So 85% of our teens have self-reported that they've reduced at least one of their at-risk behaviors. And most of our teens have certainly more than one behavior. 94% of our teens have said, I'm building healthier relationships in 3 areas: God, self, and others. 93% of our teens are graduating high school in 5 years or less, which is significant, because if a child doesn't graduate high school, their chance of success in employment just plummets. after that 18 or 19-year-old window. And then 81% of our teens are self-reporting that they are starting to make plans. They are starting to look up, not just at their toes, not just at maybe next week, but they're starting to look post-high school after they walk across that stage with that diploma in hand. So at Treehouse, some of the first things that teens hear when they come in whatever state, in whatever background, we lovingly drill into our teens what we call the 3 needs: that you are lovable, capable, worthwhile, that you are loved without strings, and that you are never alone. And for a lot of our teens, if they're coming in having recently experienced suicidal thoughts, possibly an attempted suicide, had been bullied, these are critical messages that everybody needs to hear. But for a hurting teen, this could be potentially life-saving. And I mean it. Every time Treehouse teens are together, these 3 things are repeated and said over and over again, because this is what we want our teens to carry out first and foremost, so that hopefully other positive messages can then seep in and layer on top of that as we work towards our goals. And then over time, as the needs become rooted, we really do start to see some just positive responses and progress out of our teens. A resiliency. Their attitudes change. They're believing fundamentally different things about themselves. They're making better choices to replace the choices, maybe the things they were filling their hurt and their hopelessness with. And they really are looking towards a future that would be different than it would have been otherwise. So currently we have 35 Treehouse locations. The vast majority are here in the Twin Cities. We do have a couple, as you see here. We have Philadelphia, northern Minnesota, and South Dakota, but really the vast majority are in the Twin Cities. And that speaks to, we desire to fill the need of reaching every at-risk teen here. We want to work with as many kids in that TCF Bank Stadium or US Bank Stadium visual as we can. And then we want to help others do the same thing in their community, regardless of where they would be on the map, because we want to see that grow. Just want to introduce you to one of our teens. His name is Brendan. He was one of our first teens at the Egan Treehouse. And what's important to know is Brendan's mom, when he was young, she would sell herself for drug money. And this is a teen who lives in the Burnsville, Egan community, so a suburban teen living with mom. Dad was out of the picture and kind of at the fringe of Brendan's life. But she would take Brendan along. They'd put him in her room. Mom would do what she had to do, get the money, and leave. And Brendan had no idea what was happening. And sometimes it would be at the John's house, and sometimes the Johns would come to her. And during one of her, let's just call it appointments, she was stabbed to the point where she ended up dying on the way to the hospital. So Brendan came into Treehouse a fighter. He would shut down, and he would respond very negatively to others, especially in school. And there was not much trust between he and others, especially adults. But over time, he heard you're lovable, capable, worthwhile. He heard that he was loved without strings. He heard he wasn't alone. And he saw just this comfort level that other teens who were experiencing things like he was, and other feelings and other backgrounds, he realized, I'm not the only one. This is a safe place for me. And it's really amazing because Brendan, he shared an event recently. He said, because of Treehouse, I no longer bully. I no longer feel like the world is out to get me. I no longer self-harm or do drugs. I now have a lot ahead of me. And I'm excited for what my life is becoming. I can't imagine if you'd have said, what would a 9-year-old son of a prostitute say about himself? I could never believe that these would be his words. But over time, Brendan has found a supportive and loving community called Treehouse to start unpacking his past and making plans for his future. We have a wonderful board. We happen to have the sheriff of Hennepin County on our board. His name is Rich Stanek. And Rich just so strongly believes in Treehouse. And I love the statement. He says, through no fault of their own, many of today's youth are without a nurturing environment, and they're left to their own devices. Some of these young people will not have the chance to grow up and lead happy, productive lives. I would much rather see them in Treehouse vans than in the back of my squad cars. And that's one of my favorite quotes. He knows this population, and he knows that if they're not with us or somebody like us, they're going to be with him. And that's a reactive solution after some really bad decisions have happened, bad things have gone down. He'd much rather communities invest in a proactive solution like Treehouse to help today's teens. I'm so grateful for you. I mean, this is what we want in the community. Teens and adults in the community together. We want to reduce that number. We want to reach everyone. And we're excited to engage with you about your company, your church, or how to bring Treehouse here to serve at-risk youth. So thank you very much for having me.